This week, we are looking at a significant issue, and that is whether or not we should move toward the acceptance of active euthanasia. That is to say, the acceptance of physicians or other healthcare professionals putting patients to death rather than simply letting them die. Let me remind you what I've said about what I've called our fragile moral consensus. We have said that competent adult patients are recognized as having a right to refuse treatment, including life-sustaining treatment. Secondly, when we have to make decisions for patients, allowing them to die is sometimes morally acceptable. That is to say, by withholding or withdrawing some life-sustaining treatment. It's generally recognized that there is no moral difference between withdrawing and withholding a life-sustaining treatment. So we may make a decision not to start a respirator in some situations, but having started a respirator, it's okay as well to withdraw it. There is no medical difference or moral difference there. Artificial nutrition and hydration may be refused or withdrawn or withheld like any other medical treatment. But active euthanasia, that is to say, healthcare professionals actually killing patients, is generally thought to be impermissible, and it is illegal in most states. The question we're looking at today is whether or not that aspect of our moral consensus should be changed. This is the aspect of our consensus that is maybe most fragile, about which we are still arguing. There are several factors that seem to be pushing us toward a broader acceptance of active euthanasia. Certainly the most important factor is what I've referred to before as the modern face of dying. More and more of us die over an extended period in the care of strangers in bureaucratic institutions. We now seem to fear dying as much or more than we fear death itself. Another reason is the emphasis we place on patient autonomy. We have long accepted the idea that patients should only receive that treatment to which they give their voluntary informed consent. Shouldn't this respect for patient self-determination, some would argue, extend to their right to ask to be put to death? Another factor, somewhat insignificant in this discussion, is the concern about skyrocketing healthcare costs. The idea is that we could save a lot of money. We could expend much fewer resources if we were to allow patients to seek their own death much sooner. I think an important factor might be what I often call loneliness or alienation in modern life in an urban, industrial, capitalist society. We are an increasingly elderly population. And with our youth culture, our emphasis on youth and vitality, with our emphasis on moving wherever it's necessary to move to pursue a lucrative career, many of our elderly people are lonely and alienated. Their families only see them periodically. Their families may seem not to value them. Some would argue that the push toward active euthanasia, or the acceptance of active euthanasia, is a reflection of the loneliness and the despair that many elderly people feel in this youth-friendly but not elderly-friendly culture. Cynically, one could say that it's our culture of hedonism that's pushing us towards active euthanasia. Hedonism is the idea that pleasure is the only thing that makes life good. So when our pleasure is diminished and when our suffering is great, doesn't it make moral sense simply to be killed or to die? Of course, one could argue that it's not our culture of hedonism that's pushing us toward an acceptance of active euthanasia, but rather our compassion. Our compassion for people who will not live much longer, people who will not have a high quality of life, people who are suffering. It is our compassion that's causing us to ask, is it not permissible for us to put those patients to death when that is what they want and what they seek from us? Dan Brock's essay in your assigned reading, called Voluntary Active Euthanasia, makes the most straightforward argument for voluntary active euthanasia. He wants to argue that physicians should put patients to death when they ask for it, based on the value we place on individual self-determination or autonomy. Generally, autonomy means we may not coerce or manipulate. Generally, it means for healthcare professionals that they should only provide those treatments that patients seek. Brock suggests, shouldn't we extend our sense of what autonomy requires of the healthcare professional to giving that patient self-determination over the time and manner of their dying? Secondly, he appeals to beneficence, or patient well-being, our obligation to promote patient well-being. When a patient's life is short, no matter what, when they are suffering, isn't it reasonable to say that they are better off to be put to death than to be required to experience extended and unrelievable suffering? Autonomy and beneficence, he says, both justify policies and practices of active euthanasia. Well, all of this requires us to re-examine why we have tended to think that active euthanasia is wrong. Obviously, active euthanasia involves an intentional killing of an innocent person, and that action clearly violates the principle of non-maleficence, clearly violates the value we place on life itself. Some would suggest that in a world such as ours, where life seems cheap, where many people die of hunger, or in unnecessary wars and terrorism and murder and abortion, we ought to carefully preserve the value we place on life and not move quickly to act against that value. A second argument relates particularly to the role of the healthcare professional. We will see in the essay by Daniel Callahan on the distinction between killing and allowing to die, that a part of his argument there is that even if we might think that killing a suffering, dying person might be right in some instances, we ought not have healthcare professionals do that. It's inappropriate to the role. We have physicians and other healthcare professionals to cure us and to care for us, but not to kill us. Finally, the defenders of our fragile consensus about active euthanasia would say that the appeal to autonomy, like that made by Brock, is not persuasive. As I've already reminded you, generally we think that autonomy only prevents coercion and manipulation, but it does not require us to cooperate with a person's autonomous choices. Even in the professional context, where what autonomy requires is expanded to include the idea that we should honor patients' choices, those choices are seen as limited to what is consistent with professional integrity, good medical practice, and the conscience of physicians. An additional idea here, I think, that challenges this emphasis on autonomy is the idea that ultimately our lives are not exclusively or entirely our own. Now, we obviously think that our lives are our own, and that's a part of the foundation for the emphasis we put on autonomy. Whose life is it anyway? Some people who defend the idea that euthanasia is impermissible would suggest that our lives are not entirely or exclusively our own to do with whatever we want. We have a duty to our friends and our family, or maybe even society. Of course, the most powerful argument against active euthanasia may be a religious one, which says ultimately our lives belong not to us, but to God. Or if you want to put that in more less religious or more secular terms, we owe our lives to nature. And so it is not ours, our lives are not ours to do with absolutely whatever we want. With this should give you a good basic understanding of the fundamental contours of the argument between those who support preserving our sense of the impermissibility of active euthanasia and those who support allowing active euthanasia. Next time we'll spend a good bit of time analyzing this debate, and particularly with reference to the question, where are the lines to be drawn and what is the basis for the drawing of lines? Is the important morally relevant matter the distinction between killing and letting die? Or, as others have argued, is intention the right matter? It's not whether our act kills or lets die, it's what our intention is. Where we intend death, our actions are wrong, but where we merely foresee and allow death to happen without intending it, it may be permissible. Some would put the focus another place entirely, on motives. Whether we kill or let die, whether we intend death or merely foresee it, the important issue is our motive. Where our motive is hateful and selfish, our action is wrong. Where our motive is compassionate, it is good. Well, we'll analyze the debate in terms of those distinctions in the next presentation.